Mr. Luckman and I welcome you to another discussion of the great ideas. And in this concluding discussion on man, I want to sum up and assess not only the evidence on both sides of the question, but also the importance of the issue itself. Last time, I began by reporting to you the experimental evidence in regard to animal intelligence, especially the perceptual insight of the chimpanzee. And to demonstrate some of the experiments that Kerler did with chimpanzees, I showed you how a chimpanzee made a crude tool to fetch bananas by fitting together two bamboo sticks to make a longer one. And as a matter of fact, I fumbled doing this last time, and someone who saw the show told me during the week that I had fumbled and didn't do it as well as the chimpanzee. Well, it's hard to be an intelligent chimpanzee. And though I practiced, I didn't quite succeed. Then, last time, I went on to present the evidence to support the conception of man as distinct in kind from other animals on the ground that man and man alone is rational. I presented this evidence under three main heads. Let me remind you what those heads or headings were. First, that only men make artistically. Second, that only men think discursively. Third, that only men associate politically. Now, in connection with this third main heading, there are two further points I would like to make now, which I did not have time to make last week. The first of these is that only human life has an historical development. Let me explain that. In the case of all other animals, all that they pass on from generation to generation is a biological inheritance, a physical inheritance contained in the germplasm. But men, in addition to inheriting biologically from their ancestors, inherit culturally. There is cultural transmission, the transmission from generation to generation of ideas and institutions. Mrs. Postel of Mill Valley raised this very question when she said, is not a difference in kind indicated by the fact that man is able to leave to his posterity a recorded collection of knowledge, which his thinking and experimentation in all forms of human endeavor have produced? Yes, Mrs. Postel, that is precisely the point. Without such an inheritance of ideas and institutions, no history would be possible. And that is why, because only man has such inheritance, that man, and man alone, is an historical animal. This leads me to my second additional point, which is that only men either merely subsist or live well. Only men either merely subsist or live well. Let me explain this second point. In the case of all other animals, they are more or less successful in the struggle for existence. They are more or less successful in a matter of degree in satisfying their biological needs. But only man can lead two different kinds of life. In fact, only man on Earth has lived two different kinds of life. Prehistoric man leading a life on the level of the beasts or brutes, historic man leading a civilized life. And the reason why man has and can, even now can lead two different kinds of life is the fact that his nature is compounded of two different principles, animality and rationality. This, I think, answers the question raised by Mr. John Marlowe of San Francisco. This fact that man has capacity for two modes of life. For if prehistoric man, Mr. Marlowe, was really man, and yet did not do some of the things that civilized man now does, then prehistoric man must nevertheless have had the potentiality for doing them, just as the young baby does today. The development or maturation of potentialities is not evolution. Now, what does all this prove? All the evidence I gave you last time and the evidence I added today, what does all this evidence prove? I think it shows that man and man alone is rational.
Well, now it seems to me, really, Dr. Adler, that you've been conducting a one-sided argument. As between man and animal, you've allowed man to speak for himself, and what's more, to be the judge in his own case. No one asked the animals what they think about this. And this reminded me of Bertrand Russell's comment on a very famous quotation John Stuart Mill in his Utilitarianism, and I remembered to bring the book to give you that quotation. May I read it?
Please do, please do.
John Stuart Mill wrote, "It is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. And if the fool or the pig are of a different opinion, it is because they only know their own side of the question." Now, Bertrand Russell's comment on this was, no one has asked the pig how he feels about it. So, you see, I say, no one has asked the animals what they think about the difference between themselves and man.
Well, Lloyd, that point, it seems to me, cuts both ways. Mr. Bickle of Burlingame, this very last week, sent us a clipping from Time magazine, which reports that the bowerbirds of Australia decorate their nests. Now, you recall I said last week and repeated just a moment ago that only man is a fine artist, making things sheerly for enjoyment and not for use. But, according to this clipping from Time magazine, the investigator of the bowerbirds says that the bowerbirds, I quote from Time, and you can see the bowerbirds, indulge in purely decorative art, solely for recreation and entertainment of friends. End quote. Well, all I can say is that I wish we could ask the bowerbirds why they make such a fuss about their nests. And I'd be willing to bet that if we could ask the bowerbirds, the answer they gave us would be on my side of the issue, not on the side of those who think that the bowerbirds are fine artists. Now, the reason why I come back to your question, Mr. Luckman, it seems to me the argument does not depend on our asking questions of men and animals. It depends entirely on our observing behavior, our behavior and their behavior. If what the behavior tells us, it's what the behavior tells us men do and animals don't do, not what men say they do and animals don't talk about. Nevertheless, this objection of Mr. Luckman's raises for all of us, I think, a very important point of logic. Negative evidence is always inconclusive. We can never be sure that the negative evidence is not the result simply of our failures in observation. On the positive side, we can infer man's powers from what we observe men doing. But on the negative side, we cannot be certain, simply from the fact that we do not observe animals doing certain things, that they lack the powers men have. Now notice, I said we cannot be certain. But certitude is not to be expected in the course of scientific reasoning. We must be satisfied only with probabilities. And it is in terms of probabilities, the opposed probabilities, that I am now going to try to sum up the weight of the evidence on the two sides of this great and important issue. First, in regard to man's body, here let me say that the evidence seems to me to be overwhelmingly in favor of believing or holding that man's body differs only in degree from the bodies of other animals. This supported by further evidence from embryology or by the discovery of fossil remains, I think tends to render highly probable Darwin's hypothesis about the evolutionary origin of the human body. But on the side of the human mind, I think the evidence is equally overwhelming, showing the equally great probability that man's mind differs in kind from animal intelligence. The intelligence of animals is a sensitive intelligence, an intelligence active in perception, memory, and imagination. Now, men have that kind of intelligence too, although as a matter of fact, men often have less of it than some animals do. Animals often have greater perceptual acuity than men do, or longer memory. But though animals have sometimes a higher degree of perceptual intelligence or sensitive intelligence, they do not have an intelligence, a kind of intelligence that man and man alone has. The kind of intelligence that I think is abstract or rational intelligence.
Now, I just wanted to ask you two questions about what you've been saying, Dr. Adler. And I didn't mean to interrupt you, but first of all, you said in regard to man's body that the fact of his differing only in degree supported the hypothesis that of evolutionary origin, Darwin's hypothesis.
Yes.
Now, if man's mind differs in kind, what does that imply about the origin of the human mind? That's my first question. And my second question would be, then, how can human nature, which is only one thing, not two, have more than one kinds of origin, more than one origin, differing origin?
Let me answer your two questions in the order which you gave them. First, if there is nothing in nature like the human mind, nothing at all in degree, like it in degree, then it seems to me that the human mind could not have evolved from natural things by natural causes. Its origin would require supernatural causes, divine creation. And I see no difficulty whatsoever in the hypothesis that God introduced a new principle into the world at a certain stage of its development, thus transforming what already existed into a new kind of thing. Thus, for example, taking an animal body and by introducing into it the principle of a rationality or a rational soul at that moment, creating man. This is what might have happened at an earlier stage of the development of the earth when God breathed life into inorganic matter. Let me quote you Darwin on this very point. These words I'm going to quote come from the very last chapter of The Origin of Species. Darwin has begun by saying, "I see no reason why the views given in this volume should shock the religious feelings of anyone." And he leaves open the question whether vegetable and animal organisms develop from one or from distinct primordial forms created by God. And then in his very last paragraph, in fact, his last sentence, he says, I quote, "There is grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers having been originally breathed by the Creator into a few forms or into one, and that from so simple a beginning, endless forms most beautiful and wonderful have been and are being evolved." Now I say that if God, according to Darwin, could have created living organisms as distinct in kind from inorganic matter, so God could also have created the human mind, man's rational soul, if you will, as distinct in kind from all forms of sensitive life as it exists in other animals. I turn now, then, to the importance of this issue. The importance of it considered theoretically. That is, the importance of it as it affects your thinking. And I should like to begin by asking you a direct question. Is your own mind on this issue open or closed? Is this issue itself an open or closed issue for your mind? Now I know from much experience that most educated men and women regard this issue as closed. I remember giving a lecture on this subject at the University of Chicago before a large audience of students and faculty in the Division of the Biological Sciences. And I was shocked when I discovered at the end of the lecture that most of those advanced students and scientists in the field of biology and evolution had never before heard anyone in their lifetime argue the facts against Darwin's theory of man's origin and nature. And only in the last few weeks, people who've been watching this series, taking part in this series of discussions, watching these programs, have said to me that they had never heard anyone before, as they went to school and carried on discussions, they never heard anyone before offer evidence on man's nature or origin against Darwin. This, it seems to me, is a very sad state of affairs. This one-sidedness, this closed-mindedness is an unwarranted dogmatism that is, in my judgment, dangerous to the spirit of free inquiry, and according to so eminent an English philosopher and scientist, the late Alfred North Whitehead, absolutely contrary to the true spirit of science itself. Whitehead tells us how he overcame such dogmatism in his own life. When, early in his life, at the very turn of the century, he was shocked by the fact that Newton was being proved wrong by modern physics. For centuries, Newton's laws of motion had been supposed to be the last word on the structure of the physical universe. And then, in this century, modern physics changed all that. And this awakened Whitehead from his own dogmatic slumbers. He says, my glasses, nothing is more curious than the self-satisfied dogmatism with which mankind, at each period of its history, cherishes the delusion of the finality of its existing beliefs. Skeptics and believers are all alike. And then he adds, at this moment, scientists and skeptics are the leading dogmatists. Such dogmatism, he goes on, is the death of philosophic adventure. The argument on any basic issue is never closed. This certainly applies, does it not, to the issue about man's nature and origin. Like Newton, Darwin, too, can be wrong. Now, I do not hope to convince you. I cannot hope to convince you in this short series of discussions that Darwin is wrong. But I would like to persuade you that the issue itself is far from being closed, that there is evidence on both sides, that there's reason to weigh the evidence on both sides. Why I keep asking myself, and I'm asking you too, why I keep asking myself, are there so many closed minds on this subject? I think partly the reason is that science is taught dogmatically. Science is taught dogmatically in our schools. But I think there's another reason in part, and that is the fact that evolution is one of the things which has emancipated men from religion, from the belief that God created man in his own image with a special dignity and a special destiny, including divine rewards and punishments. Let me repeat that, including divine rewards and punishments.
Dr. Adler, on that point, is this merely a theoretical matter, or doesn't it also have a practical aspect? In fact, isn't it more practical than theoretical, this issue that you're just raising? Because doesn't it concern human action and emotions as much as, in fact, if not more than, it concerns thought?
Well, it seems to me that to believe or disbelieve that God created man with a special dignity and a special destiny that accords therewith has profound practical consequences for the conduct of life, consequences which many persons wish to avoid. But it also has profound consequences of another sort that many persons wish to embrace. And this brings me to the consideration of the issue in practical terms, which in some sense is my chief interest today. Let me begin this consideration of the issue in practical terms by asking you to face one fact with me. Central to the whole moral, political, legal, or juridical, and religious structure of Western civilization is the distinction which you all know and you all use every day, the distinction between person and thing. You have no doubt about this. You never call a shoe a person. You never call even a beloved domesticated animal, a house pet, a cat or a dog, a person. You know the difference between persons and things, and this distinction, you recognize, is not one of degree, but one of kind. You don't say that something is a little more or less of a person, a little more or less of a thing. It's a sharp line that divides persons from things. Now, this distinction between person and thing is identical with the distinction between man as a rational animal, distinct in kind, not degree, from all other animals as brute. Now, let's look at this chart together and notice the fundamental properties which follow from man's possession of personality, from the fact that man is a person, not a thing. Look at them. If man were not a person, he would not have special dignity or special status, social and political status in the world. Things do not have this dignity. Things do not have this status. Moreover, all the rights and liberties we demand for human beings, they're natural and legal rights, they're natural and legal liberties. These belong to men as persons. They do not belong to things. Only persons have moral responsibility. We do not hold things morally responsible. And personality is the essence of human equality and of man's superiority to other animals. Let me spend a moment more on this last point. When the Declaration of Independence says all men are equal, what that means in its deepest understanding is that all men equally or alike have the quality, the character of being persons. Their equality is the equality of persons and all the rights and privileges and liberties that go with being a person. Not only is human equality to be understood in the fact that all men are persons, but the superiority of men over animals is also in terms of men being persons and animals being things. Let me explain this point in another chart. In this chart, let me get the main point first. Justice requires us to treat equals equally and unequals unequally. And when the unequals are regarded as unequal in kind because one is a superior kind and the other is an inferior kind, justice requires for us to treat that kind of inequality different from the inequality which is merely an inequality in degree. Now I say that if man is not superior in kind to other animals, then the rules of justice, in terms of which we treat men one way and animals another way, would all be wrong. We would have to revise all our standards in the treatment of men and animals. Let's look at this together. Now, we regard men as superior in kind, and that justifies us in regarding men as ends, to be treated as ends, whereas brute animals and other things to be treated as means, can be used. Because all men are equal in kind with one another, because all are persons, and as persons equal in kind, one man must treat another man as an end. But suppose that men were only superior to other animals in degree, that men were higher animals and other animals were lower animals. Then, if men being higher animals and other animals being lower justifies men in treating other animals as means, then by the same principle of justice, if there are superior races of men, they would be justified by that difference in degree in treating inferior races as means, exploiting them, enslaving them, even killing them. In fact, if man differs from man only in degree and man from animal only in degree, then by the principles of justice, we have no defense against Hitler's doctrine of superior and inferior races and the justification he would give for the superior enslaving, exploiting, killing the inferior. Finally, I come to my last point of practical significance, the validity of the three great religions of the West: Judaism, Mohammedanism, and Christianity in both its Catholic and its Protestant forms. The validity of these three great religions depends on the truth of the proposition that man is created by God in his own image with a special dignity and a special destiny. If this proposition is not true, then in honesty and frankness and clarity of mind, we ought to repudiate Judaism, Mohammedanism, and Christianity as idle myths, as deeply and essentially false. Now let me be sure that you understand what I have been saying. I am not asking you to accept my view that the basic tenets of Western moral, political, legal, and religious beliefs are true, and that Darwin's view of man's origin and nature is false. But I am saying to you that you must decide. Decide you must between these two views. Both cannot be true. You cannot have it both ways. You cannot keep your religious, your political, your moral beliefs, and also, with another part of your mind, hold Darwin's view of man's origin and nature to be true. Let me be sure that I've got this point clear. Our actions, I think, should be consistent with our beliefs. A letter from Mrs. McClure raised 3 points that I'd like to consider finally. She says, why do you think it is important to take sides on the issue about man's origin and nature? And how does taking sides influence one's behavior? And why isn't it enough, she says, merely to be informed about the opposite views of the question? I think I've answered these questions, but to be sure, let me repeat these two basic points. I think one's actions should be consistent with one's beliefs. We are all guilty of hypocrisy if we believe that Darwin is right and at the same time go on acting as if he were wrong, enjoying the privileges of human dignity, even demanding them, but at the same time denying the very facts on which that dignity and its privileges are based. Now, this concludes our discussion of the issue concerning man, his origin, and nature. Next time, we begin the discussion of another great idea, this time the idea of love. And under the heading of love, on this idea, there are 4 topics I would like to discuss in successive weeks. First, the kinds of love. Second, love as friendship, or another way of saying that is love without sex. Third, sexual love. And finally, in view of these different kinds of love, the basic problem of the morality of human love. I hope you will be interested in this idea and in the topics which it suggests for us to discuss, and I hope your interest will be expressed in letters or questions concerning love, its kinds, and the problems that love raises for human conduct and human life. Thank you very much.